They thought they could quietly seize my family's land with nothing more than paperwork and intimidation. They didn't expect me to dig through dusty deeds, hire a lawyer, and beat them at their own game, all without lifting a finger outside the law. This is how the HOA tried to take everything from me, and how I fought back legally. Daniel Carter had always thought of his grandfather's land as an anchor. 5 acres of rolling pasture and oaks on the edge of Oak Ridge Estates. It was the only piece of his family's history that had survived the march of time and development. The property line was marked by a crumbling stone wall his grandfather had built by hand, and beyond it sat the glossy new homes of a subdivision that hadn't even existed when Daniel was a child. On a crisp October morning, Daniel carried a mug of coffee down to his mailbox, expecting the usual bills and junk flyers. Instead, he found an envelope with a heavy official-looking seal from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. "Strange," he muttered, turning it over. His property had never been part of the HOA. He was outside their gates. Inside the envelope was a notice of incorporation on thick, cream-colored paper. The letter claimed that as of September 1st, the association had extended jurisdiction over parcels adjacent to the subdivision for community enhancement purposes. The notice informed him that his land was now subject to Oak Ridge Estates bylaws and monthly dues, backdated for 6 months. At the bottom, in bold, it warned that failure to comply may result in legal action, including but not limited to a lien or seizure of property. Daniel reread the letter 3 times. He knew enough about property to understand how absurd it sounded. HOAs didn't just annex private land, but the formal tone, the citations of statutes, and the threat of seizure rattled him. He called the number at the top of the letter. A clipped female voice answered. "Oak Ridge Estates HOA, this is Mrs. Lang." "Yes, this is Daniel Carter on County Road 82, he said. "I just received a notice claiming my property is under your jurisdiction." "That must be some mistake." "No mistake," she interrupted. "Your parcel benefits from our drainage upgrades and road maintenance. As such, you're required to comply with association standards and pay the assessed dues." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I never agreed to that. My grandfather bought this land in 1963. We're not part of your HOA." "You are now," she said flatly. "If you fail to remit dues within 30 days, the board will initiate enforcement proceedings." She hung up before he could respond. Daniel stood in his kitchen staring at the letter, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He could hear his grandfather's voice in his head. "This land is your birthright. Never let anyone push you off it." But how did you fight an entire association with lawyers and bylaws? Over the next few days, strange things began happening. 2 men in polo shirts and lanyards showed up at his gate with measuring tapes, taking pictures of his barn. An orange sticker appeared on his mailbox marked non-compliant structure. A second letter arrived, this one listing violations such as unapproved fencing and improper agricultural use. The fines listed at the bottom added up to over $4,000. Daniel's neighbors, new arrivals in the subdivision, looked away when he waved. One whispered to another as he passed, "He's the holdout. They're turning his place into a park." Late at night, unable to sleep, Daniel sat at his kitchen table under a bare bulb, his grandfather's old deed spread out before him. It was handwritten, recorded in 1963, and included a survey map showing clear boundaries. He traced the stone wall with his finger. Outside the map was blank space, the area where Oak Ridge Estates now sprawled. "This is my land," he whispered. "They can't just take it." He began jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. County Records Office, property law, original plats. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to roll over and hand over his birthright because of a letter with an official seal. That night he locked his gate for the first time in years. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, but beneath the anxiety was a flicker of something steadier. Resolve. If the HOA wanted a fight, they'd get one. But it would be on his terms and by the book. For the next week, Daniel lived as though under siege. Every morning when he stepped out to feed the chickens or check the fences, he would find some new sign of the HOA's presence. A laminated notice zip-tied to the gate, bright orange stakes driven just inside his property line, a stranger in a golf cart idling at the edge of the road taking pictures with a tablet. The first notice accused him of failure to maintain approved landscaping. The second warned of Unauthorized agricultural operations. Each one came with a fine neatly typed at the bottom, hundreds of dollars at a time, with a growing balance due in bold. It was harassment by paper cut. Daniel tried phoning the association again, but he only reached a voicemail system with endless menu options. When he left messages, no one called back. When he drove to the HOA's office, the receptionist told him politely that all communications must go through the board's attorney, and handed him a card with a law firm's name printed in sharp blue letters. He began to keep a spiral notebook on his kitchen counter. Every time someone from the HOA set foot on his property, he wrote down the date, the time, and what they did. He started snapping pictures on his phone, 2 board members peering over his stone wall with clipboards, a man in a reflective vest taking a soil sample, a bright yellow non-compliance sticker plastered to his barn door. At night, the old farmhouse felt cavernous and lonely. The subdivision's streetlights glowed beyond the oaks like a hostile city. Daniel would sit at the table with the notebook and the deed spread out, reading and rereading the handwritten legal description, 5 acres, more or less bounded on the north by County Road 82, on the east by the stone wall erected in 1963. It was clear. There was no mention of Oak Ridge Estates, no reference to covenants or restrictions, nothing tying his land to their bylaws. Yet the letters kept coming. One evening, a certified envelope arrived from the HOA's law firm. Inside was a formal notice of lien. They claimed he owed $6.72.13 in unpaid dues and fines, and that the association was placing a lien on his property. Pursuant to the governing documents, the words seemed surreal. Governing documents. He didn't even have a copy of whatever they were referring to. Daniel felt his chest tighten. A lien could cloud the title. It could scare off banks' potential buyers. It was the first real shot across the bow. The next morning, instead of making more phone calls that went nowhere, he drove to the county courthouse. The clerk at the recorder's office, a kindly woman with glasses on a chain, helped him pull the subdivision's original plat map. He laid his grandfather's deed next to the map. His parcel was clearly outside the shaded area of Oak Ridge Estates. "Has the HOA ever recorded an amendment?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not that I can see. They filed a revised map 2 years ago, but it was never approved by the county commission. Technically, it's just a proposal." Daniel's heart kicked up. "Do you have a copy?" Within minutes, he was holding a thin packet of papers stamped received but not approved. The HOA had drawn new boundaries around his parcel and several others, scribbling common area acquisition in the margins. But without the county's signature, it was nothing but wishful thinking. He took photos of everything, scanned the maps, and asked for certified copies. Back at home, he spread the papers across his kitchen table. For the first time since the ordeal began, a sense of clarity settled over him. "They don't own this land," he murmured. "They're bluffing." But a bluff could still be costly if he didn't counter it properly. He needed someone who understood property law, someone who could hit back in the language the HOA used: statutes, case law, injunctions. That evening, he dialed the number of a local attorney whose name he'd found on a property rights forum, Susan Miller. Her assistant listened patiently to his story, then said, "Ms. Miller handles a lot of HOA abuse cases. She can see you tomorrow at 10. When Daniel hung up, the farmhouse felt a little less lonely. He walked out to the stone wall at dusk. Beyond it, the subdivision's manicured lawns stretched in neat rows, but on his side, the pasture glowed gold in the fading light, dotted with wildflowers his grandfather had planted decades ago. "They're not going to take you," he whispered to the land. "Not without a fight." Susan Miller's office sat above a bakery on Main Street, the smell of fresh bread greeting Daniel as he climbed the narrow stairs. Inside, rows of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, and a framed certificate from the state bar hung behind her desk. Susan herself was brisk but warm, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a bun, a legal pad already open in front of her. "Tell me everything," she said, sliding a mug of coffee across the desk. Daniel spread out the documents he had gathered. His grandfather's deed, the certified copies of the county plat maps, the HOA's letters, even the photos of men trespassing on his property. As he spoke, Susan scribbled notes in shorthand, occasionally underlining a phrase. When he finished, she leaned back, steepling her fingers. "What they're doing is classic overreach," she said. An HOA cannot unilaterally extend its jurisdiction. Without a signed covenant or an annexation agreement approved by the county, you're not subject to their rules. This so-called lien is likely invalid and could constitute slander of title. Daniel felt a spark of hope. So what can we do? First, a cease and desist. We'll demand they remove the lien and stop harassing you. At the same time, we'll put the county on notice that this revised map was never approved. If they ignore us, we file suit. Declaratory judgment, injunction, damages. Her tone was calm but confident, the way a surgeon might describe an operation she'd done 100 times. Daniel realized how badly he needed that steadiness after weeks of intimidation. Back at home that evening, he watched as Susan's paralegal emailed him a draft letter on firm letterhead. It was 4 pages of cool surgical language citing state property statutes and case law. Each paragraph dismantled the HOA's claims point by point. The final line gave the board 10 days to retract the lien and acknowledge in writing that Daniel's parcel was not subject to their bylaws. He printed it out and read it twice. For the first time since the nightmare began, the paper in his hands felt like a weapon instead of a threat. The next morning, the letter went out by certified mail. Daniel kept a copy pinned to the refrigerator door like a talisman. Days passed with no response. The orange notices stopped appearing, but the silence was unnerving. Then, on the 7th day, a thick envelope arrived from the HOA's attorney. Inside was a short, defiant letter stating that the association stands by its actions and would continue enforcement. They had not only refused to lift the lien, but had added another $800 in fines for obstruction and non-compliance. Daniel drove straight to Susan's office, the letter trembling in his hand. She skimmed it and raised an eyebrow. "Good," she said. "They've put it in writing. Now we sue." That afternoon, she filed a complaint in county court seeking declaratory judgment, removal of the lien, and damages for trespass and slander of title. The clerk stamped it with a loud thunk that echoed in the hallway. "They've picked the wrong fight," Susan murmured. Over the next few weeks, the preparation for trial became Daniel's second job. He spent evenings digging through boxes of his grandfather's old paperwork, finding utility bills, tax records, anything that established his family's continuous ownership. He printed out dozens of photos of the stone wall, the barn, the pasture. Susan coached him on how to testify calmly and factually. "No speeches," she said. "Just the facts. Let the evidence tell the story." Meanwhile, subtle changes rippled through Oak Ridge Estates. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze now waved hesitantly. One older couple stopped by the gate to apologize. "We heard about the board trying to take your land," the man said. "It's not right. We've been fined for ridiculous things too." Daniel realized he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was exposing a pattern. Susan nodded when he told her. "Juries and judges notice patterns," she said. "It shows bad faith." The trial date was set for early spring. In the weeks leading up to it, Daniel's anxiety mounted, but so did his resolve. Each time he looked out at the pasture turning green again after winter, he reminded himself why he was doing this. This wasn't just acreage. It was his grandfather's legacy, his future children's inheritance. It was the principle that a piece of paper shouldn't be able to erase a lifetime of ownership. On the night before the hearing, Daniel stood at the kitchen window, the courthouse documents stacked neatly on the table behind him. Beyond the stone wall, the subdivision streetlights glowed like a line of enemy torches, but on his side the field lay quiet and dark under the stars. "They've had their turn," he said softly. "Tomorrow it's mine." The county courthouse was a squat limestone building with a clock tower that always ran 5 minutes slow. On the morning of the hearing, Daniel arrived early, his hands gripping a leather briefcase Susan had lent him. Inside were copies of every deed, survey, photograph, and notice he had collected over the past months. Susan met him on the courthouse steps, crisp navy suit, hair pinned back. "Remember," she said quietly as they walked inside. "Calm, factual, polite. Let the evidence speak." They took their seats at the plaintiff's table while the HOA's board members clustered behind their attorney at the opposite table. Daniel recognized Mrs. Lang among them, arms folded, lips tight. Their lawyer, a tall man with a silver tie, shuffled papers with practiced ease. When the judge entered, the room rose. A gavel struck wood. "This is Carter versus Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," the clerk intoned. Case number 23CV 1984. We're here on plaintiff's motion for declaratory judgment and related relief. Susan opened with a measured statement. She explained that Daniel Carter owned a 5-acre parcel recorded in 1963, never annexed or covenanted to the HOA. She held up the certified copies of the original plat maps and the county's stamp showing the revised map was never approved. Despite this, she said, the defendant has asserted jurisdiction, imposed fines, and recorded a lien, clouding Mr. Carter's title. We're asking this court to declare that the HOA has no authority over his property, to order the lien removed, and to award damages for trespass and slander of title. Then she called Daniel to the stand. His palms were damp as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Susan guided him through the story gently. The first letter, the notices on his barn, the trespassing board members, the lien. Each answer felt like laying another brick in a wall between himself and the HOA's claims. The HOA's lawyer rose for cross-examination, voice smooth. Mr. Carter, isn't it true that your property benefits from Oak Ridge Estate's drainage improvements? Daniel kept his voice steady. I've maintained my own drainage since my grandfather built the farm. No one from the HOA has ever worked on my land. Yet you drive on roads maintained by the association, do you not? County Road 82 is maintained by the county, not the HOA, Daniel said, holding the judge's gaze. Susan introduced photos of the stone wall, the barn, the posted notices. She entered into evidence the county's letter stating the revised map was never approved. Each exhibit landed with a quiet finality. When the defense presented its case, it felt thinner than Daniel had expected. The HOA's lawyer pointed to bylaws and community benefit, but when the judge asked for a signed annexation agreement, he admitted there wasn't one. The association believed, he said, that adjacent parcels were implicitly bound because they gain from shared infrastructure. That's not how covenants work, the judge muttered, making a note. After lunch, Susan delivered her closing argument. My client is not seeking special treatment. He is asking only for what the law already provides, that a private association cannot seize authority it was never granted. The defendant's actions have not only harassed Mr. Carter, but jeopardized the integrity of our property records. If such overreach were allowed to stand, no landowner near a subdivision would be safe. Daniel felt a tremor of pride hearing her speak. For months, the HOA had made him feel small and isolated. Now in this courtroom, the balance had shifted. He glanced back at the board members. A few avoided his eyes. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I'll take this under advisement, he said. Written decision within 2 weeks. He gave the HOA's lawyer a pointed look. In the meantime, no further enforcement or trespass on Mr. Carter's property. Understood? Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer murmured. Outside on the courthouse steps, Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The spring air smelled of rain and warm stone. Susan gave him a small, confident smile. You did well. Now we wait. Waiting turned out to be harder than he expected. Each day he checked the mailbox, heart thudding at the sight of any official envelope. But the orange notices stopped. No one from the HOA came to his gate. The land grew quiet again, the pasture deepening to green as the weeks passed. Late one afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered over the ridge, Daniel stood by the stone wall watching swallows dive over the field. He thought about his grandfather, about the nights he'd sat at this same kitchen table balancing ledgers, paying taxes, keeping the farm alive. We're almost there, he whispered. Just hold on. 2 weeks felt like 2 months. Every morning Daniel opened his mailbox with a knot in his stomach, half expecting another certified envelope. Every evening he walked the fence line as if the act itself could anchor the land beneath his boots. The pastures were alive with spring growth now. The wildflowers his grandfather had seeded decades ago had returned in a sea of yellow and purple. It was beautiful, but it made the waiting harder. All this could vanish on a judge's stroke of a pen. On the 15th morning, the letter finally came. A plain white envelope from the county courthouse. Daniel stood in his kitchen staring at it, fingers trembling. He thought about setting it down, waiting for Susan, but he couldn't. He tore it open. Order and judgment, the heading read. His eyes skipped down the page. The court finds no evidence of annexation or covenant. Defendant acted without authority. Plaintiff's title remains free and clear. At the bottom, the lien recorded by defendant is hereby vacated and expunged. Defendant is enjoined from any further enforcement or trespass. Costs and attorney's fees awarded to plaintiff. Daniel sank into a chair, the paper falling to the table. It was over. He had won. He called Susan. "Did you get it?" "I did," she said, and for the first time her professional calm cracked into a grin he could hear through the phone. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter, they're finished." The next day they went back to court for a brief hearing on damages. Susan argued for compensation for the months of harassment, the slander of title, the stress and time lost. The HOA's lawyer tried to minimize it. Mere administrative error. But the judge wasn't buying it. He ordered the association to pay Daniel's legal fees plus a modest sum for damages. When the gavel fell for the last time, Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest so suddenly, he almost laughed. He shook Susan's hand outside the courthouse. "I don't even know how to thank you." "Take care of your land," she said simply, "and keep every piece of paper forever." Word spread quickly through Oak Ridge Estates. A local reporter called asking for an interview about the homeowner who beat the HOA. Daniel politely declined, but he couldn't stop the ripple effect. Neighbors stopped him at the grocery store to say they were glad he'd stood up to the board. One man confided that he too had been fined for absurd violations and was thinking about challenging them. That weekend, Daniel invited a few longtime friends over. They sat on the porch drinking iced tea, watching the sun set over the pasture. The stone wall glowed golden in the light. "It feels like the farm can breathe again," one of them said. Daniel nodded. "So can I." The following Monday he received an official document from the county recorder, release of lien, stamped and sealed. It was a simple page, but to Daniel it looked like a medal. He pinned a copy next to the cease and desist letter on the refrigerator door. This time the paper in his hands didn't feel like a weapon or a threat. It felt like protection. He also received a letter, unsigned but clearly written by someone inside the HOA, apologizing for the board's behavior and promising to push for new leadership. Daniel read it twice, surprised at how little anger he felt now. Mostly he felt tired and relieved. That evening he walked out to the old oak tree at the center of the field. The air was heavy with the smell of clover. He thought of his grandfather again, of the stories about fighting off speculators in the 70s, about paying taxes during hard winters just to keep the land. "We did it," Daniel murmured, laying a hand on the rough bark. "They tried to take it, but we did it." He looked back at the farmhouse silhouetted against the fading light. For months it had felt like a bunker. Now it looked like home again. Spring turned to early summer, and with it came a strange quiet. For the first time in months, Daniel's gate remained free of stickers, his mailbox free of threats. The only envelopes he opened now were from friends and the occasional thank you card from neighbors who had followed his case. One afternoon, a pickup truck slowed at the edge of his drive. A man in his 40s climbed out, hat in his hands. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. "Name's Jim. I live 2 streets over. We heard what you did. Board's been fining us for stupid stuff for years. You proved they can't just bully people." Daniel invited him in for coffee. Jim described how the HOA had cited him for unauthorized mulch color and fined his wife for planting tomatoes in their backyard. "I thought about selling the house," Jim admitted. "But maybe now, maybe we fight back." More stories followed. A retired teacher stopped at Daniel's gate to thank him. A young couple dropped off a pie with a note. "Thank you for standing up for all of us." He realized his lawsuit had broken something open. He had gone to court to save his own land, but in doing so he'd shown his neighbors they weren't powerless. The HOA board tried to downplay the loss. A bland statement appeared in the community newsletter about a jurisdictional misunderstanding, but within weeks 3 board members had resigned. At the next meeting, homeowners demanded elections and transparency. The aura of invincibility was gone. Daniel watched it all from a distance. He didn't want a seat on the board. He wanted his peace back. But when local radio asked him to speak on a segment about property rights, he agreed. Sitting in the studio, microphone before him, he told his story simply. "I'm not anti-HOA. I'm against overreach. Know your deed, know your rights, and keep your paperwork." Back at the farm, life slowly returned to its old rhythms. He repaired fences, planted new grass in the bare spots the surveyors had trampled, and repainted the barn doors. Each stroke of paint felt like reclaiming something that had been chipped away. Some nights he still woke in the dark, heart pounding, thinking he heard a car idling at the gate. But the fear ebbed faster now. He would get up, open the door, and see only the quiet field under the stars. The stone wall, the oak tree, the farmhouse, they were still there, still his. On a warm evening in June, Susan came by for a visit. She had been in the area for another case and wanted to see the land she'd helped protect. They walked along the fence line as fireflies blinked in the grass. "You know," she said, "most people give in. They pay the fines, sign the papers, and hope it goes away. You didn't." "I had my grandfather's voice in my head," Daniel said with a smile. "And your voice telling me to keep everything factual." She laughed. "That helps too." They reached the oak tree. Susan touched the rough bark. "It's beautiful here. You should think about putting your story in writing. People need to hear how you did it, maybe," Daniel said. "For now, I'm just glad to have my mornings back." They stood for a moment in silence, the sound of crickets rising around them. Then Susan turned to him. "You know, the law's on your side more often than you think, but it only works if you're willing to use it." "I know," he said. "I've learned." After she left, Daniel sat on the porch watching the fireflies. The farmhouse no longer felt like a bunker. It felt like a beacon. In fighting for his land, he'd reclaimed not just his property, but his sense of belonging. The following autumn arrived soft and golden. Daniel woke each morning to a horizon that was entirely his own again. Fields rimmed with mist, the barn glowing in the early light, the oak tree standing like a sentinel. The battle was over, but its echoes remained. The county clerk sent him a certified copy of the court's final order. It bore a judge's inked signature and a seal pressed deep into the paper. Declaratory judgment, property rights vested with Daniel Carter. He framed it and hung it beside his grandfather's old map. 2 generations of perseverance side by side. Life didn't snap back to its old shape overnight. There were still meetings with surveyors to repair damaged boundary markers, and a stack of HOA correspondence he refused to ignore. But the letters had changed. Now they began, per the court's decision, and ended with, "Sincerely, the board." There were no more threats, no more fines. At the community's next election, dozens of homeowners showed up, some holding copies of Daniel's filings. They voted out the old guard and replaced them with neighbors who promised transparency. A new bylaw passed limiting the HOA's reach over non-member parcels. Daniel stayed out of the race but sat in the back, arms crossed, a quiet witness to the change. Later, when a local newspaper wrote an article about the man who beat the HOA, Daniel agreed to a short interview. He didn't gloat. He talked about process and patience, about keeping meticulous records, about knowing where to find dusty deeds in courthouse basements. The reporter asked what advice he'd give others. "Don't panic," he said. "Document everything, and don't be afraid to stand up illegally or for what's yours." That winter, he took a week off from his contracting work and started a small blog. On quiet evenings, he wrote down the whole story, from the first ominous letter to the final judgment. He included copies of sample filings, tips for checking plat maps, and a section called Lessons Learned. Within months, emails arrived from across the country, a widow in Arizona fighting a wrongful lien, a veteran in North Carolina dealing with an overzealous board. Daniel answered as many as he could, offering encouragement and pointing them toward legal aid. One crisp December morning, as frost glittered on the fields, a young father stopped by with his daughter. "We just wanted to see the farm," he said. "You gave us courage to fight our HOA." They took a picture by the oak tree. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a mix of pride, relief, and quiet gratitude. The farm had always been about more than land. It was his grandfather's sweat, his parents' evenings repairing fences, his own memories of learning to drive a tractor in the back field. By defending it, he had preserved that story, and perhaps shown others how to protect theirs. He realized he wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a custodian of a larger idea, that ordinary people can use the law to push back against overreach. On New Year's Eve, he sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Across the field, the oak tree swayed in the cold wind, roots deep, branches reaching outward. Fireworks crackled faintly from town, but out here it was mostly quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. He thought of his grandfather again, of all the times the old man had said, "This land is your anchor." Daniel smiled. "It still is," he whispered. A light snow began to fall, dusting the porch and the fields beyond. Daniel stood, took one last look at the view he had fought to keep, and went inside. The farmhouse door closed softly behind him, not in retreat but in peace.